Hello again. In this video, I'm going to be talking about tithing, and I'm not sure yet if this is going to be one video or a series of small videos. Just depends on how the time goes as I go through this study that I did. And this is probably going to be one of the more detailed things that I've covered. I spent a lot of time, listened to a lot of different people preach on this, spent a lot of time thinking about it and meditating on the verses that I covered when I was doing this study. And so I think you will find this study very interesting. It's other people have covered tithing that are people that I respect as Bible teachers, but I think you're going to see some things in this study that you may have not ever heard before or seen or thought about as you read about tithing in your Bible. So let's just get started here. And the first thing I want to do is talk about the purpose of this. And the purpose of this study is to determine whether Christians are biblically required to give 10% of their gross income or 10% of whatever somebody thinks they should give. But it's typically taught as 10% of gross income, as well as examine the methodologies that I'm aware of behind some of the claims of those who teach tithing as a Christian principle. In addition, this study will cover what is expected of a Christian with respect to giving. So that will be that will definitely be a separate video, what the Christian is required to give aside from the tithing issue, that the New Testament giving principles or giving teachings and doctrines. Now, I approached this study without consideration or accusation as to the intent of the tithe teachers, but simply did my best here to did my best as God showed me to lay out the facts described in Scripture and applied some meditation or critical thinking to them as well. And so the first thing we want to do is define the tithe, the biblical definition of the tithe. And so today Christians commonly use the tithe to refer to a tenth. They know that when something was tithed, a tenth was given. This comes from Leviticus 27:32, which reads, "And concerning the tithe of the herd or of the flock, even of whatsoever passeth under the rod, the tenth shall be holy unto the Lord." Now it's also understood that a tithe is a tenth from reading Hebrews 7, where it describes that Abraham paying tithes as a tenth of the spoils to Melchizedek. But what did God require to be tithed? Now, the first mention of tithing in any form is in Genesis 14:20, when Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. I'll talk about Abraham in a separate section, but I just wanted to mention there about the first mention of tithing. The next time that tithing is mentioned, although it is implied in Genesis 28, but it's not mentioned there, is Leviticus chapter 27, which we read about the tithe in verse 32, when God commanded the Old Testament law to Moses. This chapter defines the tithe required of Israel as a tenth of the, I'll call it the crops. He calls it, you can refer to it as the seed of the land, anything grown, and the fruit, so the crops and fruit, seed of the land. It's not the best, and it's a tenth of the clean beasts, not the best. I keep saying that because you'll see why that's important later. See Leviticus chapter 27, verses 30 to 34. Now there are a lot of different verses, excuse me, that I'm going to cover in here, and I'm not going to read them all. It's just it's too many verses. It's too much information. And I thought about maybe putting it down in the text box, but some of the passages are just too long. So I'll give you all the references, and you can look them up, pause the video, and go and look them up as you're going through this or whenever you like. Now, if a person is going to quote Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Nehemiah, Malachi, Matthew, what's where the tithing is taught or referenced. If they're going to use that to teach tithing, then that person should use the exact definition used by Moses, Nehemiah, Malachi, and Jesus. I want to just stop here for a second because I forgot to do something. I wanted to recognize the work of Russell Kelly, who's I used his work as a resource in putting this together. So if you have read some of his stuff, you're going to read. So you will see some of the same things in this video that you've seen him, because he did a really good work on tithing. I don't agree with all the things that he taught in there, all the conclusions that he came to, but it's a good resource, and I use that as in producing this study and these videos. So as well as many others, but that's somebody that I wanted to recognize. Anyway, in doing this, the work that he put into that teaching and his study. But I did listen to many different sermons, hours and hours of sermons, and studied many things with respect to tithing on my own, and there's a lot of things in here that are things that the Lord gave me. But anyway, I wanted to do that and forgot. So the tithe basically does mean the tenth. However, in the Bible, the word tithe does not stand alone. Its meaning is very limited, and although money existed before tithing, the source of God's holy tithe was never money. And that's, if you read from Leviticus to Luke, anywhere the tithing is mentioned in there, it's not money. See Malachi 3:10 also, and Matthew 23:23, which we'll cover those verses later. The increase was not from man's hand or ability. The increase was from what God himself miraculously produced from his own holy land. See Genesis 20:18, Genesis 29:31. I have here, where's that? Isaiah. Couldn't read my own little shorthand there. Isaiah 30 verse 23 and Ezekiel 36 verse 30. No holy tithes could come from non-food items. Couldn't come from Gentiles or from unclean pagan lands. The children of Israel did not tithe while they were wandering in the wilderness. Here are all of the passages concerning Israel under the law that deal with what exactly was tithed. Leviticus 27:30-32, Numbers chapter 18 verses 27 to 28, Deuteronomy 12:17, Deuteronomy 14:22 and 23, Deuteronomy 26:12, 2 Chronicles 31 verses 5 and 6, Nehemiah 10:37, Nehemiah 13:5, Malachi 3 verses 10 and 11, Matthew 23:23, and Luke chapter 11 verse 42. A lot of these verses we will go over some point later, but I just wanted to put those out in this section so you have them to look at. Notice that money was never tithed. It was always food. Even in Deuteronomy 14 verses 24 to 27, when the tithe was to be changed into money, once the person got to Jerusalem, the money was to be changed back into food. The tithe was only to be temporarily converted to money because of logistics. So they had all these flocks and all these bushels of wheat or whatever they had, and it was just too much to carry to Jerusalem for this particular tithe, which we'll get into in a little bit. They were allowed to change that into money to take it to Jerusalem, but then they had to buy whatever they were going to eat and share with the Levites and whoever that was going to feast with them. So they had to. It was only changed to money temporarily. They didn't take the money then and donate it to the temple. Now let's see. So we've covered the biblical definition of the tithe. So we want to get into the first time tithing is mentioned now, which is just checking my time, 10 minutes. Okay, Abram's tithe. Okay, so Abram's tithe to Melchizedek is recorded in Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 to 20. From the context of this passage and from Hebrews chapter 7, verses 1 to 4, we can tell that Abram's tithe was a free will spoils of war tithe, not a commanded tithe. You often hear tithe when someone says, "Oh, tithing was that's Old Testament." Sometimes a rebuttal to that will be, "Well, Abram tithed before the law," so it will be tried to be applied as a principle of tithing today, because tithing was before the law. So you use Abraham. Tithe teachers will use Abraham as an example of tithing before the law. But it's important that we look at what was tithed. Now, so Abraham's tithe was spoils of war. You can read the references that I gave there. It was not commanded tithe. It was not the same as the holy tithe referenced by Moses, Nehemiah, Malachi, and Jesus. In Numbers chapter 31, verses 21 to 31, God's law required less than 1% of the spoils of war as an ordinance. I'm looking at that percent now. I'm thinking, not sure about that, but it was way. Let me just say, it was way less than 10% as a spoils of war. It was something between, like, I think it was anywhere from like 1 to 2.5%, depending on what was tithed. But I think my note may be incorrect there. But it's much, much less than 10%. It's somewhere between like 1 and 3. And you can check that out and do the math in Numbers 31, verses 21 to 31. Therefore, had the law existed in Abram's time, he would only have given a fraction of the amount that he did. Abram's tithe was a one-time recorded event that is never mentioned under the law. Abram's tithe was not from his previously owned personal property, and Abram's tithe is not quoted anywhere in the Bible to endorse tithing by Israel or the church. Abram's tithe is not a type of someone giving the first and the tenth of his increase. Abram's wealth did not increase a shoe latchet. See verse 23 in that passage in Genesis, from Genesis chapter 14. Abram returns everything he captured to the king of Sodom, save what he mentions in verse 24, and none of that increased his wealth. So Abram went out and the point was to go and get Lot, rescue Lot from the kings that defeated the king of Sodom. And in the process of killing all the enemies, Abram gets all the things back that were taken from the king of Sodom and all those people, and the people that they took and captured, as well as probably the items that originally belonged to those kings that Abram defeated. So he got all the spoils of war from those kings, and he also got back the king of Sodom's stuff, as the Bible uses that word quite a bit. So Abram comes back from that battle, and he's met by Melchizedek, and he's blessed by Melchizedek. And Abram gives a tenth of the spoils, which I take my opinion, I take to mean all the things that he took that belonged to those other kings. And I don't count even if you did, it doesn't matter. But I don't count the king of Sodom and all those people with Lot that were defeated. All of their stuff that Abraham recovers, I don't count that as the spoils of war. But anyway, so Abram gives a tenth of the spoils of war to Melchizedek. Then he returns everything else, everything he got back that was not tithed. He returns that to the king of Sodom. The king of Sodom says that he says to Abraham, just take the stuff, I'm not sure which way it is now, take the stuff and give me the people, or take the people and give me the stuff. And Abraham says that no, he didn't want the king of Sodom to say that it was by his doing that he made Abraham rich. So Abraham didn't take one shoe latchet, as it says in verse 24, from that victory. He gives the tenth of the spoils of war, according to Hebrews chapter 7. And then he gives everything else to the king of Sodom except what was, there were some things during the battle and on their way back that they had to eat. They took some of the spoils and they made food from it, but the men had eaten. And I think there were 3 different men with him that Abram gave some of the spoils of war to. But Abraham, his personal wealth did not increase a cent, using American terms today for money. But anyway, so he didn't. Abraham says a shoe latchet. So he didn't get anything additional. So Abraham did not give a tenth of his increase because he didn't increase anything. Now, the second tithe that I saw in the Bible here is, I'll call it Jacob's tithe, in Genesis 28, verses 20 to 22. And although this is not specifically labeled a tithe, it is considered a tithe because Jacob promises to give a tenth of all that God gives him. But once again, this tithe is not a command from God, but it's based on Jacob's vow, and that the tenth given to God was conditioned upon a number of things Jacob states, including, so that I come again into my father's house in peace, verse 21. Now, Jacob says, if God, you do this, 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 and this, then I'll give you a tenth. So that would include him coming into his father's house again in peace. Now, we know that this did not happen for over 20 years because Jacob was serving Laban that long. See Genesis chapter 38, Genesis chapter 31, verse 38. So it is only after those 20 years, that Jacob would have began giving a tenth of all that God gave him. And again, so it really doesn't make sense to use this as an example of Christian tithing, because Jacob it was free will. He made a bargain with God. God, if you do this, is that the way tithing is taught today? Well, make a deal with God. God, if you give me a house, if you give me a good job, if you. No, that's not the way tithing is taught today. So this is not it's not a good example of why a Christian should tithe. Let me look at the time here. 17 minutes. I think I'm going to stop this video here. We're going to stop it with Abram and Jacob's tithe. And in the next video, we'll get into Israel and the Levitical tithe. So watch for part 2. That'll be coming shortly. And thank you for watching. And I hope this first part was a blessing to you. And I'll see you in the next video. Have a good day.